Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, born, we think, in 1469 and dying in 1536, was the outstanding Christian humanist of the Northern Renaissance, a model of disciplined scholarship, of literary elegance, of refined friendship and severe and sincere personal Christian piety, and also of a tolerant awareness of the need to avoid conflict in resolving issues which are as likely to wound spirits as they are to shed blood, and much more likely to do either of those than to find and establish truth. He spent his life fighting ignorance and superstition, but he came to find enthusiasm almost as dangerous. And in this discovery lies a great part of Erasmus' significance for our own age. Erasmus' life was kind of a model of this kind of humanistic discipline. He was the illegitimate son of a rural priest who overcame the embarrassment of his origins by a youth of self-restraint and deep study. His mother was the daughter of a physician. They were an entirely respectable family. And his uncle took care to provide Erasmus with the basic ingredients of a decent education. Erasmus studied at an Augustinian monastery in Holland, whose community he joined as a novice, and then he left before taking final vows. He went on to Paris, to the Collège Montaigu of the University of Paris, but he never graduated. He deeply disliked the scholastic rigidity, the puritanical discipline, and the miserably bad food of his Parisian collège. Not a very French thing, he said. Later on, he praised the French for the natural intelligence of their women, for their superior food, and for other qualities that seemed to him appropriate to an educated Christian people. Going beyond his teachers and the courses of study they offered him, Erasmus perfected Petrarch's style of Latin prose and became the first West European competent enough in Greek to edit the Greek New Testament. Because of that remarkable skill, he was appointed the first Regius Professor of Greek, the first Royal Professor of Greek in Cambridge University, and was the only man teaching Greek, it would appear, in England for some years. His reputation as a man of letters was unsurpassed in Western Europe during his lifetime. He was in that sense the heir of Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century, the forerunner of Voltaire in the 18th. His complete published works contain some 16 million words in 150 volumes of moderate size. Practically everybody of importance and intellectual pretensions in his time wanted to know what Erasmus thought about theology, about church reform, about classical literature, about current affairs, and lots of less serious matters as well. Erasmus's collected correspondence contains thousands of letters and much more information about this kind of exchange, this kind of public communication on the top level of the European elite comes from the dedications and forewords to Erasmus's numerous books and pamphlets. In a way, the most striking, or at any rate the most distinctive note about his role as an arbiter of letters for his age is his fascination with technology, the technology of learning, to wit, in his time, the printing press. Erasmus was born a quarter century after Gutenberg commenced in Mainz to change forever the instruments of learning and communication over distance and time that had fixed the limits of intellectual intercourse for humans for more than 4 millennia. Erasmus loved the smell and feel of printer's ink, the human interaction of the printer's shop, as well as the crunching of metal print on paper, and the whole process of illustrating, binding, and distributing the precious books which were his life. Perhaps more than any of his contemporaries or immediate predecessors, Erasmus understood what printing could do to change the world he knew. Erasmus never needed to accept any of the many posts he was offered. He may be the first person in history to have made a good living entirely from his writing, always in Latin, his first language, almost his mother tongue. He rarely, if ever, wrote in Dutch. We have the indication that he may have written some letters in Dutch, but he took care to see that none of his Dutch writing survived. Latin was really his mother tongue. And the living he made from it was a good living, in the most acceptable sense of the term. He remained monastic in his distaste for gluttony, drunkenness, self-indulgence in general, but he thought decent food was essential to his health, and he liked good wine. There are wonderful stories about the mules, which he hired to carry his baggage across the Alps and across the long roads of Europe for his endless crisscrossing of that continent. The particular sound they emitted was the clink, clink, clink of bottles of very fine vintages attached to the baskets on their backs. Erasmus wrote copiously in several genres. First of all, formal letters, thousands of them. There's always been a favorite literary form of Renaissance movement. He also wrote model conversations to improve your Latin. He wrote treatises on a wide range of topics, including biblical criticism, church reform, Christian ethics, and Christian theology. And he also wrote satire. The most bitter of his satires is called Julius Exclusus, or The Exclusion of Pope Julius, which he wrote in 1513 about Pope Julius II, who had reigned as vicar of Peter from 1503 to 1513. This is a particularly bitter satire because Giulio della Rovere, who took his own name as pope, calling himself Julius II, a most unusual thing for popes to do, which shocked a good number of people at the moment, and which seemed to be an omen of the way Julius would conduct his papacy, had been an early hero of Erasmus. He was a vital and vigorous man who went overboard in his desire to save the papal state and church liberty from secular control. And so his enthusiasm for this laudable goal undid him and made him a horrible example, a shocking example of the abuse of a tradition as far as Erasmus was concerned. This was written after Julius' death, to be sure, but it got Erasmus in considerable trouble because to attack any pope was to attack all popes in the mind of the people who still controlled the machinery of repression in Western European Christian society. Perhaps the most readable of Erasmus's works today is a gentler satire, but a very mysterious and confusing one, The Great Praise of Folly. It was called Encomium Moriae. Originally, that's its original punning title. It was dedicated to Erasmus's good friend Thomas More, whose company and whose household he enjoyed for long stretches while he was in England. More was a man who loved a good joke. And the name More in English, of course, is rather like the Greek word moros, which means fool, as in sophomore, and in moria, folly, whose encomium Erasmus wrote, dedicating it to More, hoping that he'd enjoy the complicated multi-level joke that this all involved. Its reception throughout Europe in the years after 1511, it was reprinted over and over and over again, not only with Erasmus' approval, but with, this was before the age of copyrights, but with much more enthusiasm than Erasmus found comfortable as time went on. This reception made Erasmus the Voltaire of his time. And he is much more like Voltaire, I think, than like Bernard of Clairvaux. Like Bernard of Clairvaux, he had a monastic taste, and he had a great taste for classical rhetoric and for the fathers of the church. But like Voltaire, he had a biting wit, which could cut right to the point of the matter. The central character of this remarkable dialogue is Folly herself, who preaches a sermon on folly, on herself. It's a highly complex and elusive satire, which has given rise to wildly different interpretations. As great a scholar as Roland Bainton almost dismisses it as a literary exercise done for Erasmus' diversion, and then which became a source of embarrassment, which he later rejected. Most critics see the praise of folly as much more than that. Here's how it goes. Folly mounts the platform, some platform, we don't know whether it's pulpit or simply some kind of speaker's platform, perhaps a schoolroom event. And she says that she's going to speak extempore. She's wearing a jester's cap and bells, so you shouldn't take too seriously anything she says. In fact, her extempore speaking is very impressive because she speaks with all of the conventions of the most sophisticated rhetorical traditions, all the distinctions and devices, all the subtle turns of phrase, etc. She mocks, first of all, marriage and procreation. If anybody really knew what was involved in raising children, they would never let their enthusiasm for a partner of the other sex lead them that far. She then mocks excessive candor, the insufferable honesty, which leads some people to be unendurable to their neighbors, to their society. Better to be happily seated in Plato's cave watching the illusions than to be one of those enlightened who are brought up to see the sun, Erasmus says. Can he have meant that? One doubts that he possibly can have. Folly then mocks scholars who wear out their eyes and the rest of their constitution years before their time reading obscure texts, just indeed as Erasmus had done, though he doesn't say that there. But then she mocks class-conscious foolishness. And she mocks the folly of scholastic theologians who get all tied up in splitting hairs about nominalism, realism, conceptualism, and all the rest of it. She mocks monks, hypocritical monks, not true monks. She mocks kings and nobles who neglect their people. Scholars with their obscurantist footnotes, just like that Erasmus, here he does say it in so many words, scholars who cover texts with footnotes that obscure rather than reveal what the text is all about. Folly mocks with particular sharpness theologians who justify wars, who justify the shedding of blood, for example, by popes like Julius II, using the doctrine of the just war developed by Augustine and Aquinas and others to make okay their tawdry grabs for pieces of territory in Europe. Finally, to considerable surprise to the reader, folly becomes the foolishness of the cross. The anomaly of Erasmus' folly is that she herself berates the fools, that at last she turns out to be the fool in Christ, who appears foolish to those who could deem themselves wise in this world. This is every human commitment is brought up under the gaze of folly's remarkably skillful rhetorical tirade. God cannot commit excess, so the incarnation and crucifixion are not folly, however extreme and incomprehensible they may seem to us. But every other human commitment, however good essentially, may be rendered foolish and worse by going overboard. Enthusiasm is an apparent virtue to be dreaded, this satire of Erasmus teaches us, or at least it is a human virtue to be treated with great caution. Erasmus' distrust of enthusiasm was central to his thought and his literary output. Throughout his work, Erasmus attacked the superstition which reached a climax, the superstition of the cult of saints and of going on pilgrimage. Instead of the piety of pilgrimages to the shrines of saints, many of whose authenticity was deeply dubious, he said, instead of the frenzied acquisition of indulgences, which reached a climax in the early 16th century, thanks to the fiscal requirements of a worldly papacy, either fighting wars like Julius II or building the huge monument of St. Peter's Church like his successor, Leo X. What contemporary Christians needed to cultivate, Erasmus said and wrote over and over, was the philosophia Christi, the philosophy of Christ, by which Erasmus meant the life of the Gospels as well as any formal doctrines, perhaps rather than any formal doctrines. Along with the Philosophia Christi, Erasmus had no hesitation in combining what he saw as the best in pre-Christian classicism, the purest element in his eyes of Greco-Roman philosophical thought and behavior. He referred constantly to the example and the philosophy of Christ and Socrates. Socrates, though certainly no Christ, certainly no incarnate God, was for Erasmus more than the father of philosophy. He was a pre-Christian martyr to the truth, almost a Greek John the Baptist. A typical statement of Erasmus's ease with classical education, with the classical legacy, is the treatise on the education of a Christian prince, which he wrote and had published in 1515 and dedicated to the young Archduke Charles of Austria, the Habsburg prince who was expected to become Holy Roman Emperor. Erasmus had been appointed one of his counselors with a very nice stipend, so he wrote this book of counsel to his possible future sovereign, to whom he felt a clear and appropriate kind of debt. In it, Erasmus says, "Get educated by reading Plutarch, Seneca, Cicero, and above all, Plato." All of these authors, except perhaps for Plato, who advised not going overboard, who urged on their followers the wisdom of the golden mean, of restraint, of classical rejection of excess. And he also urged the prince and his educators to avoid any nonsense about Arthur and Lancelot, tragic instances of what uncritical enthusiasm can lead one to. When Martin Luther first attacked the indulgence trade in 1517 and took to task these worldly popes whom Erasmus had been attacking, Erasmus was strongly in favor of his protest. He also supported Luther's attack on the general corruption of the papacy and his insistence on reading the Bible directly rather than listening to scholastic interpretations of scriptural doctrine. But when Luther said that the rule to follow in judging one's own Christian faith was sola scriptura, to do it by scripture alone, Erasmus hesitated and held back. For Erasmus, tradition was, if not as important as scripture, certainly important as well, and essential to the complete message of Christianity in his understanding. And this was a tradition which, of course, had been based upon classical legacy and classical thinking and classical models of behavior, as well as upon Hebrew biblical ones. When Luther developed a stringent interpretation of the doctrine of predestination, which he did in 1521, in the third of his three famous letters that shattered the intellectual peaks of Christendom, a doctrine of interpretation which denied any role to the freedom of the human will, a corollary of which Luther was both logical and enthusiastic. Erasmus simply had to part ways with him. For Luther, the corollary that the human will really had no freedom, which is a corollary of the logic of his predestination argument, was a corollary which he, A, denied, and B, was not bothered by. It wasn't really true. Of course, the will was free. When people pressed him, as Erasmus did in letter after letter over the next 3 years, to explain how this was possible, Luther, first of all, showed irritation, and then finally considerable annoyance. In 1521, after he published The Praise of Folly, 10 years after he published The Praise of Folly, an exact decade, Erasmus began this correspondence with Luther. Luther's literary style was always powerful and could be corrosive in disagreement. As the exchange progressed, Luther became verbally abusive, even grossly vulgar. By 1524, Erasmus had definitely and finally broken with Luther. The instinctive humanist that Erasmus was determined to find some place in the process of salvation for the free choice of humans to cooperate with God's grace. He could not stand the notion that God was a tyrant, cruel if somehow arguably just, predestining some to eternal torment and some to eternal bliss. Here was another case of a good man and a good doctrine led astray by what Erasmus saw as enthusiasm. Everywhere he looked, Erasmus could discern examples of the fatal seduction of enthusiasm. First of all, early on, he'd begun to warn against the enthusiasm of simple believers for the saints of the church, which led them to idolatrous and sometimes financially ruinous cult of relics and pilgrimages. He had a great deal of fun. Had a very good time making fun of the cults of St. Barbara as opposed to St. Eustatius, both of these extremely dubious historically, which reminded him of the cult of pagans attached to this god and that demigoddess and attacking one another in the process. Certainly the cult of the saints should have brought all Christians together towards the foot of the throne of God. Instead, this particular kind of enthusiastic devotion to one or another's protector, one or another's celestial patron, had brought them into a kind of conflict which was deeply disedifying and deeply inappropriate. Then Erasmus was struck, a little bit later in his work, by the enthusiasm of lovers of classical literature for every object of their study, every aspect of that study. Erasmus himself adored classical literature. He loved Latin to the point that he really tried to make it even more effectively the medium of communication for everybody in Western Europe. Latin had been the medium of communication for the educated, for the upper classes, for the rich, whether they were educated or not, who would certainly have secretaries, who could write contracts, and who could write important business letters in Latin. There were, of course, business letters in Italian and Dutch and French and English, but Latin letters were always better and often thought to be legally more binding. Erasmus was very concerned about the proper pronunciation of Latin. Since Latin was supposed to be the medium of polite exchange, he wanted it to be understandable, so that those who had learned Latin in Italy and those who had learned Latin in Scotland would be able to communicate. Instead, what usually happened was that they could not understand each other at all. There's a famous exchange from the 18th century demonstrating the long-term danger of the problem Erasmus was trying to obviate. Voltaire went to England, and he met Johnson, and the great Samuel Johnson. Each of them spoke in Latin to the other, since neither wished to try the other's language, and neither could understand what the other was saying. The pronunciations of the English public school boy and the French student of the Jesuits were so radically different that there was no communication whatever. Erasmus tried to figure out what the classical pronunciation of Latin had been, and he did a pretty good job of that. He and his friends who worked in various printing shops and who were able to compare texts from different periods, Greek texts rendering in the Greek alphabet Latin words, which clearly had been pronounced when that rendering occurred back there in the classical era, very differently from the way they were pronounced later. And also the Latin translation of Greek terms. And he tried to find out exactly what the classical pronunciation of Greek and Latin were. And if it was classical, it was correct. And so everybody ought to pronounce Latin in a classical fashion, which is very much the effort of faculties of classics in American and Scottish and German and European universities today. Erasmus's major work towards this goal of classical perfection, unfortunately, came to not much in the way of a conclusion, because in the century after Erasmus, the vernacular tongue sprang up to become the normal media of communication in West European society. So Erasmus is certainly an enthusiastic lover of the classical legacy. But not every object of classical literature, not everything presented, not the immoralities, not the confusions as to priorities, not the love of too good a life. What he disliked was what led to a sort of digging up again, an uncritical exhuming of pagan values and priorities. And this he felt very strongly in the sermons that he heard in Rome in the year 1509. Sermons preached during the Christmas season, not in honor of Christ, not by the Pope, who traditionally was supposed to deliver quite a series of sermons at that particular point, but in praise of the absent Pope Julius II, who was out conquering parts of the old papal state, which had been alienated by the wicked Cesare Borgia, and reintegrating them into the papal state. Pope Julius II was praised by the humanist preachers whom Erasmus heard, and he was compared in elegant Latin to such models as Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Epaminondas of Thebes, and other great pagan shedders of blood. Erasmus was also disturbed about all of the closet pagans whom he knew all too well. People who had, because of their love for classical literature, their love for classical culture, essentially thrown off Christianity. They couldn't afford to do that publicly, but in their private lives, in their private conversations, they made clear a very broad range of skeptical thoughts and skeptical beliefs. The enthusiasm of Pope Julius for the liberty of the Church was, again, another example of what enthusiasm could do to a good man and a good cause. Julius was very concerned about the fact that in every part of Western Europe, the local church was slipping more and more under the control of kings, or in the case of Italy, of republican governments, where perhaps the medieval church had gone too far in the mind of Julius and Erasmus and most of their contemporaries, had gone too far in asserting its independence of secular authority, of creating a kind of theocracy which has its precedence in the Hebrew Scriptures, but which was certainly not part of the legacy of the gospel. Thomas Aquinas had defended papal theocracy, but he was very hard put to find any scriptural text with which to back up that fundamentally more Aristotelian than Hebrew doctrine. Now this had vanished, had gone away. The church had lost much of its credibility. In Germany, local princes wanted to get even more control over the church than they already had. The Holy Roman Emperor fought with them to maintain the degree of control he had over appointments and over church properties. Very shortly in England, of course, King Henry VIII would break with Rome in order to achieve complete control over the economic life and the personnel of the church, and he had already given signs as early as 1513 that he was tending in that kind of direction. In France, recently, the church had come completely under the domination of the state, and Julius's successor would sign a peace treaty with the French king, which would subject the French church absolutely to royal control. All of these movements were in the making, not finally consummated until after the vigorous reign of Julius II, who was as staunch a diplomat as he was a warrior. But Julius was determined to try to stop this. And why did he want to try to stop this? Because he had a vivid sense of the church as the legacy of Christ. The legacy of Christ to the poor, to the widows, to the orphans, people about whom the kings of the world cared not a whit, except in occasional pious statements with a little bit of alms. And what Julius was trying to do as a first step in restoring to the Western Church its autonomy and its primacy, its control of the fortunes of the poor, was, first of all, to recuperate the papal state. Well, what had happened, of course, was the tragic going overboard. His enthusiasm for that end allowed him to indulge another enthusiasm, an enthusiasm for artillery. It was said that the sound he loved most in the world was not Gregorian chant, was not the sound of the recitation of the gospel, Nor was it, of course, the secular singing of lyric poets, the romantic, themes of the drama. It was the sound of cannon in firing. And he loved to go out and see the papal cannon fire away and just not think about the bodies of Christian men who were dismembered by the cannonballs when they landed. The thing that most upset Erasmus, I think more even than the sermons he heard on behalf of Julius's martial presence rather than his role as vicar of Christ, was the sight he'd seen before he went to Rome in 1509. He was working in Venice with the great printing press of Aldo Minuzio. He went down to the city of Bologna, which had been a part of the papal state for a very long time. It was detached from the papal state by Cesare Borgia, the natural son of the wicked and corrupt Pope Alexander VI, and made part of the Borgia family property. Then the Bolognese rebelled and established their own independent government under a kind of a condottiere rather than a republican regime. And this is not a very impressive kind of government, and this is what Pope Julius conquered. Erasmus saw Julius riding into Bologna in a great triumphal procession in which he was dressed magnificently, not as the vicar of the poor man of Galilee, but as the world's greatest prince, in the finest silks and brocades and cloth of gold that the Renaissance could provide, wearing on his head, as a sign of his office, a mitre studded with pearls and embroidered with gold thread. And Erasmus wrote that he asked himself, watching the sight, is this man the vicar of Jesus Christ or of Julius Caesar? And since he had kept his own name, Julio, when he ascended the papal throne, Erasmus felt that at last, finally, alas, he knew the answer. Erasmus died a dozen years after he had parted ways with the enthusiastic reformer Luther. He died in 1536, the year the young John Calvin published his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is perhaps the classic statement of Protestant Christianity, at least of that variety of Protestant Christianity which has the doctrine of predestination as its cornerstone. Not a book Erasmus would have liked. Erasmus was not unhappy to die, having outlived the humane Renaissance, whose most optimistic phase he had embodied with such sober brilliance. Erasmus' legacy lived on, reaching a second peak in the ecumenical movement of 20th century Christianity. I think that most Christians of the Catholic tradition, which had earlier seen Erasmus as subversive, and the tradition of the mainline Protestant churches, whose predecessors had earlier seen Erasmus as evasive, as he argued with Luther about grace and predestination and the role of free will in human salvation. These traditions all see Erasmus as a great prophet, a great forerunner of the way Christianity ought to be. The kind of Christian humanist, not secular humanist, that Christianity seeks to produce, or should seek to produce, in the realm of culture which it can influence. But before the ecumenical movement of the present century, the now vanishing century, Erasmus's legacy had inspired the most tolerant wings of Western Europe's established national churches. For example, the extraordinary religious tolerance of the established Calvinist Church of the Netherlands, Erasmus' own homeland. Though Erasmus never went back to his homeland after an early point in his life, he was very proud of the Dutch for their industry and their understanding. Although the Church of the Netherlands was a Calvinist church, the leaders of that church were very aware that once they won independence from fanatically Catholic Spain in the late 16th century, they had within their territory a large and very Dutch Catholic minority to rule, and to rule justly and happily. And they also had to deal with the tendency of Calvinist churches to split apart over fine points of doctrine, with the same kind of enthusiastic zeal that had characterized the divisions among Dominicans, Franciscans, conceptualists, realists, and nominalists in medieval Catholicism. And so this church from the early 16th century, early 17th century onward, began to be extremely tolerant to private Catholicism and invited Jewish communities from all over the world to come to Amsterdam and make it the center of free Jewish self-expression, which it did indeed become. Indeed, Polish Catholicism was also extraordinarily tolerant until it was taken over by Cossack attack from beneath and conquest from outside by Russian and Prussian and Austrian rulers. And certainly in England, Erasmus' legacy inspired the Low Church and High Church latitudinarianism of 18th and 19th century Anglicanism. In a more secular vein, I think one could say that Erasmus' condemnation of enthusiasm, even in what might seem at first a good and idealistic cause, helped inspire Edmund Burke's stirring defense of tradition in his writings on the French Revolution, and even in a funny kind of turnabout that Erasmus might have accepted, inspired Burke's defense of what he called prejudice. Not what we call prejudice, but what a learned man might recognize.